This section is on what is known as the divided kingdom period of Israel's history. It follows the story of the nation of Israel from the end of the reign of Solomon through to the exile of the northern kingdom, and then later the exile of the southern kingdom. You can read about this period of Israel's history in the books of 1 and 2 Kings, and also again in 1 and 2 Chronicles. Previously, in the United Kingdom period of Israel's history, Kings Saul and David and Solomon reigned over a united kingdom. Solomon started off very well, but towards the end of his reign, he began to amass power and wealth and women. And it was particularly his many wives from many nations that turned his heart away from following God to worship idols. Back in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, Moses had warned against this very thing, saying that your kings, Israel, are not to amass power and wealth and women, because they will lead your heart astray. This is exactly what happens with Solomon. And so our period picks up as Solomon has just died and his son Rehoboam has taken the throne. Things are in chaos. The people are demanding a lighter load. Rehoboam doesn't know what to do. He's asking advice from the elders and from the people his own age. He's being challenged by a powerful, popular leader, Jeroboam, to lighten the load, but he answers the people harshly, and a civil war ensues, in which 10 of the tribes break away from Rehoboam and form their own nation, crowning Jeroboam as king of the northern kingdom, which is known as Israel. Eventually, the capital city will be Samaria. The southern kingdom only consists of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, which stay loyal to King Rehoboam, and they became known as the Kingdom of Judah. And so in this period of Israel's history, there's not one nation, but 2 nations, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. You can refer to the map, and that will help make sense of where this is taking place as well. Let's start with the northern kingdom. In the books of 1 and 2 Kings, the stories of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom are tangled together in a way that can be quite confusing. It's very helpful to have a list of the kings and when they reigned and what was going on. You can refer to that handout as well. But let's start in the northern kingdom. Jeroboam immediately led the northern kingdom into idolatry, creating 2 idols, Dan and Bethel, and changing the system of worship and leading the people not to follow God anymore, but to follow idols. This idolatry continues in the northern kingdom as it exists for a period of just over 200 years. And each of the 19 kings that are listed are called bad by the author of the book of Kings. In this story of the northern kingdom, there are many coups and murders of these kings and many wars as things go from bad to worse. By the end of 1 Kings chapter 17, this northern kingdom has been conquered by the Assyrian Empire, who's taken the people into exile. 1 Kings chapter 17 lists one of the major, 2 Kings chapter 17 lists one of the major reasons for the exile as their idolatry and their faithlessness to the covenant to worship only God. Now down in the southern kingdom of Judah, whose capital remains Jerusalem, things go slightly better at the beginning. There's also 19 kings in the southern kingdom and 1 queen. Some of them do okay. King Jehoshaphat, King Hezekiah, King Josiah are some of the best that remain loyal to God. But most of the kings of Judah also turn away from God, worshiping other gods or worshiping him in ways that are contrary to the covenant. And though the southern kingdom does last a little bit longer, it also is conquered by another nation, this time the Babylonian Empire, which leads the people into exile. And so this period of the divided kingdom starts off at the end of Solomon's reign with things a bit shaky and goes from bad to worse as each one of these kings has a decision to make. Will they be loyal to God and the covenant, or will they turn from God and the covenant and worship idols? Eventually, the idolatry becomes so bad that these nations are taken over by other nations and sent into exile. And these books end in a very tragic note. One of the major themes we see in the book of 1 and 2 Kings is the role of the prophets within the nations of Israel and Judah. The prophets were God's messengers, and they would often come with messages calling the people and the kings back into covenant with God. In fact, right where 1 and 2 Kings joins together, we can see the story of the prophet Elijah and the prophet Elisha as they do miracles and give messages again and again to the kings. But the kings usually don't listen to these messages. And so God is faithful to remind the people, but they're often not listening to that word that comes from God to be faithful to the covenant. Now, one of the things that can make this period very complicated is lots of kings. In fact, there's almost 40 different kings to keep track of. And as the book of Kings is written, it flips back and forth and back and forth, back and forth. And so it's very vital to look at that handout to make sense of what's going on. A second thing that can make it quite difficult to understand is how the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles fit with the books of 1 and 2 Kings. Because as you read 1 and 2 Chronicles, if you've just read 1 and 2 Kings, it feels like you're repeating a lot of the same material. And in fact, you are. So what's the point of these two different storylines going on, telling almost the same story? Well, 1 and 2 Kings focuses on both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The book of Chronicles, though, focuses only on the southern kingdom of Judah. The books of 1 and 2 Kings focus largely on the role of the prophet within the society and how the kings display their loyalty to God through listening to the word of the prophets, or more often by not listening to the words of the prophets. Over in the book of Chronicles, it's the story, but with an emphasis on the role of the priests and the temple in Jerusalem. And here the focus is not so much on the role of the prophets, but on the role of the priests. And so in the books of Chronicles, the big question is, will the kings be loyal to temple worship according to the covenant or not? And so they both tell the story, but from slightly different points of view. Kings focusing on the prophets and both the northern and southern kingdom, and Chronicles focusing on just the southern kingdom, but with a focus on the prophets. One of the most important things in understanding the books of Kings and Chronicles is to see the role that the covenant plays in the storyline of Israel. Now, you may recall that the covenant was made at Mount Sinai back in the book of Exodus. And it was an agreement between God and the entire nation of Israel. The covenant is summed up in the 10 Commandments, but there's actually much more to it than just those 10 Commandments. One of the most important parts of the covenants for understanding Kings and Chronicles is the prohibition against idolatry. Israel was meant to have no other God except Yahweh, and they were supposed to worship him at the temple in the way that God described to them, particularly in the book of Leviticus. What was going to happen if they didn't follow God and worshipped idols? Well, we can see that in Deuteronomy Chapter 28. This is a very important chapter when it comes to understanding the books of Kings and Chronicles. Deuteronomy 28 is sometimes referred to as the chapter of blessings and curses. In ancient covenants, it was very common to have a series of blessings attached to it. If you follow the covenant and keep to these terms, these blessings will follow you. And also a series of curses, that if you break this covenant, all of these bad things are going to happen. And in Deuteronomy 28, we see a list of the blessings and curses. If Israel follows the covenant, then these blessings will come upon them. But if they forsake the covenant and follow other gods, worshiping them, then all of these curses will come upon them. And so it's really interesting to read that list of blessings and curses alongside with the evaluation of the kings in the books of Kings and Chronicles. One really interesting thing we see in the list of curses is right towards the bottom, that if the people refuse to follow God, and he's given them many times, one of the things that he promises is, I will lead you into exile. That is, I will allow other nations to conquer you and to take you out of the promised land. And this is actually what we see happening in the books of Kings and Chronicles. The people continue in their idolatry so long that God, in faithfulness to the covenant agreement, actually allows them to be conquered by other nations and go into exile. And so where it might seem like God has forsaken the people and their story is over, it's actually at that point that we see that he has the covenant in mind. But you know what follows that exile? It's redemption. Because God promises there in Deuteronomy 28 that when the people are in exile, he will restore them if they turn their hearts back to him. And so in this book, though we see the people's failure to follow the covenant, we see God's faithfulness to the covenant, both in sending prophet after prophet after prophet to the people, but also in fulfilling the terms of the covenant and in the promise of redemption that we'll see later on in the story. Another way that we can see God's faithfulness to the people in this period of time is in relation to a promise that he made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. In this passage, David has desired to build a temple for the Lord. But Nathan, who is a prophet, gets a message from God and says to David, "You're not to build me a house, but I'm going to build you a house." Little pun there. And he promises that one of David's sons will always sit on the throne before God. And it's this promise, the promise that David's line, his family line, will always be the rulers of Israel, that we see fulfilled in the books of Kings and Chronicles. You only have to compare the southern kingdom of Judah to the northern kingdom to see this emphasis. In the northern kingdom of Israel, they had 19 kings, but they had many different families. After 3 kings of this family, there'd be a coup. After 2 kings here, this king would be murdered and another family would take over. And so there's a lot of chopping and changing in the northern kingdoms on who is ruling. But in the southern kingdom, despite their idolatry and their unfaithfulness and the wars, there's always a descendant of David to sit on the throne of Israel in Jerusalem. And so we see God's faithfulness to the nation through his faithfulness to King David. That there's always a son of David to sit on the throne. But you know what? There's something even more important going on behind the scenes of this book and the whole biblical story. Let's take a minute to understand what's going on in this promise to David. Go back with me to Genesis chapter 3. This is often called the fall of man. God is dealing out the consequences for the broken instruction not to eat that fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when God is speaking with Eve, he makes a very interesting promise. He says, one of your descendants will crush the head of the serpent. In other words, there's going to come a man or a nation or a descendant of some sort from this woman that's going to defeat this serpent and restore humanity to its rightful place. Well, continue on in the story. We get to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. There's been no promised descendant yet, but suddenly God calls Abraham and says, to you and your descendants I will give a blessing, and through you all the nations on earth will be blessed. Suddenly we have this promise again coming up. Well, continue on the story, and we get the nation of Israel that's descended from Abraham. And God makes a covenant with them in the book of Exodus. And he says, you are to be a blessing to all nations. Well, we follow that story on, and eventually we get to King David. And God blesses King David and says, one of your sons will always rule before me in Jerusalem. In each one of these instances, it's the same promise, different wording, but the same thread being woven through the biblical story. But watch where it's going. When we get into the New Testament, particularly the book of Matthew. Right at the beginning, we have a genealogy. And Matthew takes pains through many names to help us to see that Jesus is not just some guy, but an Israelite. And not just any Israelite, but a son of David. And as we follow the book of Matthew, we see that Jesus is ultimately the one that will sit on the throne of David, and the one that will rule the nations and restore humanity to their rightful place. You see, right throughout the biblical story, there's a promise of the coming Messiah. Here in the books of Kings and Chronicles, in the divided kingdom period, that promise of the Messiah is centered on the role of David and David's sons being the kings of Israel. And so in this period of time, one of the major messages that we can see is God's faithfulness to the people of Israel through having a son of David, but not just his faithfulness to Israel, his faithfulness to all the nations, because through one of those sons of David, eventually, the blessings to the nations that were promised to Abraham will come. Through one of those sons of David, we will have the snake crusher come, the promised Messiah. And so it's astounding to see God's faithfulness, not just to Israel, but to the nations in this period of history, particularly because it's one of the worst periods of history for Israel's history through their disloyalty and their idolatry. I want to finish talking about the divided kingdom by tying in the themes of this section of the story into the broader themes of the whole biblical story. And we can see that particularly as we look back at the beginning of the Bible into Genesis 2 and 3. And we can see that the storyline of Kings and Chronicles actually maps right on to the story in Genesis 2 and 3. Let me explain. In Genesis 2, God creates a man and he places him in the Garden of Eden. And the garden there is pictured to be the holy mountain of God where God walks with humans. And it's this wonderful sacred space. You know, in the story of Israel, God takes a nation from nothing and places them in the promised land. And this land is meant to be a place where they worship God at the temple and where God's presence and humans' presence come together. In fact, often when the Bible is referring to the nation of Israel and the promised land and Jerusalem and the temple, the language and the imagery that's used is the imagery of the Garden of Eden. It's wanting us to draw those connections that what God is doing there in the promised land is recreating what he intended at the beginning of the story. Back at the beginning of the story, of course, Adam and Eve have a decision. Will they be loyal to God or will they be disloyal to God? And their decision revolves around the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Over here in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, the nation has a decision. Will they be loyal to God or disloyal to God? And the issue for them is primarily the covenant and idolatry. And in both stories, the main characters fail. What happens in 1 and 2 Kings? The people are sent in exile to the east, to the nations of Assyria and Babylon. Back in Genesis, the same thing happens. Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden to the east. But you know what? That isn't where either story finishes. In Genesis, it doesn't take long before we're at the story of Abraham. And God calls Abraham from the east to go back to the promised land where he's going to make a covenant with him that will bless all the nations. In our period over in Kings and Chronicles, well, the nations aren't going to remain in exile. God's going to come and send them back to the promised land, and he's going to renew the covenant and redeem them. And so in our period and in the book of Genesis, we see these great themes of covenant and failure and redemption right throughout the biblical story. It's the message of the cross as well, isn't it? The covenant that's broken, our failure, and God's redemption and renewal of that covenant. And we can see that shining through at many different points of the biblical story, no less than right here in the divided kingdom period, God's covenant and the people's failure, but his redemption that will come in the next period of history. Thank you.
That was session 6 of the Bible overview. Chris brought so much clarity on what can be a confusing time period of the divided kingdom and exile. Not only did he help define the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah, but he showed us why this is so critical in the redemption story. Leave a comment letting us know what you've been learning so far in the Bible overview. And Chris mentioned many resources you can find in the highlight, and the application questions in the caption for this week will help you see the connection between the covenant and the kings. Get ready to have Caitlin back next week to wrap up the Old Testament and set the scene for the coming Son of David.